Then we'll go to Erik Malmqvist, who is an associate professor of medical ethics at Linköping University. You, Erik, have been dealing with ethical issues around drugs and drug trials, and also tissue transplantation, if I understand it correctly. So we are looking forward to hear from you on falsified medicines, ethics, and global justice. Please.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to be here and participate in the conversation about this very important issue. I'm going to try to address four distinct points in this talk. First, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what appears to be a striking lack of attention from ethicists to the problem of falsified medicines. I'm going to say a few words about why that might be and what might be problematic about it. Second, I'm going to suggest that it's useful to think of the circulation of falsified medicines as a kind of market, with a supply side and a demand side, and which side, so to speak, of the market we look at will affect how we evaluate it ethically. Third, I'm going to talk about falsified drugs from the point of view of global justice, and I'm going to suggest that we can't think of this problem in isolation from another and perhaps even more fundamental problem, namely the lack of access to essential medicines in many poor countries. And fourth, I'm going to switch focus from developing to developed countries and say a few words about what sort of lessons could be learned from adopting a similar viewpoint in the developed world context. So when I was first asked to talk about falsified medicines from an ethical perspective, I was a bit puzzled, I have to confess. I thought, do we really need ethicists here? It should be clear to anyone that the large-scale global circulation of falsified medicines is highly ethically undesirable because of its terrible impact on personal and public health. And it should be clear to anybody that those who intentionally produce, distribute, and sell these drugs are morally blameworthy and should be punished. So it doesn't seem that we need any particular ethical expertise to draw these conclusions. And I think to the extent that other ethicists have thought about this issue, they have adopted maybe a similar viewpoint. At least that would explain why there appears to be hardly any attention to the problem of falsified medicines in the fields of medical ethics and healthcare ethics. But I think this lack of attention from ethicists is unfortunate. We should, or we need, careful ethical analysis even in cases of clear and severe unethical conduct, such as this one. One reason why we need careful ethical analysis even in that kind of case is, or has to do with the phenomenon that the philosopher Alan Wertheimer has called moral occlusion. So Wertheimer notices that wrongdoing is often composite or complex. It is made up of more than one wrongful act. When we think about such complex cases, there is a tendency that the more severe wrongs hide or overshadow the less severe ones. But although the less severe ones are comparatively minor, they may actually in absolute terms themselves be quite significant wrongs and should therefore not be overlooked but included in our sort of ethical analysis. So inspired by this, I'm going to try to look beyond the most obvious harms and wrongs involved in the global circulation of falsified medicines in order to see what other ethical issues there might be that might be worth our attention. As a starting point, I'm going to adopt a very simplified economic perspective. I think it's useful to think of the the circulation of falsified medicines as a kind of market. On the one hand, there are those who produce, distribute, and sell these medicines, the supply. On the other hand, there are those who seek out, buy, consume these medicines, the demand. Now, there's been considerable attention to the supply side, I think. Those who produce, distribute, and sell falsified medicines are harshly condemned, and many proposals for addressing these problems target these agents. So, for instance, the Declaration of Rome begins by stating that counterfeiting medicines is a violent, serious criminal offense that puts human lives at risk and undermines the credibility in healthcare systems. And it continues that because of this, it should be combated and punished accordingly. Similarly, the WHO's Impact Task Force identifies 5 sets of measures that are especially important for dealing with the problem of falsified medicines. The first is to strengthen national legislation, including sharpening punishments for falsifiers. The second is to improve regulation and oversight of the distribution of medical products. The third is to improve legal and regulatory enforcement by strengthening connections between enforcement agents in different countries. The fourth is to disseminate information about technologies that help prevent, deter, and detect falsified medicines. And the fifth and last measure is to increase awareness of the problem through information campaigns aimed at policymakers, health professionals, enforcement officers, and the general public. And with the exception of this last measure, you can see that these interventions all address what I have called the supply side of the market. So they try to protect people from harm by curbing production, distribution, and sale of falsified medicines. And we've heard sort of similar proposals, similar perspectives in some of the earlier talks today, I think. Now, of course, such supply-side measures are very important. I'm certainly not going to deny that. What I would like to suggest, though, is that we shouldn't forget that there is also demand side of the market. We need to understand why people buy and use falsified medicines. So we need to understand what beliefs, desires, and concerns that motivate people, and more generally, what situation people are in. Among other things, this is important if we want to reduce demand for these medicines by increasing public awareness. But we also need to look at the demand through an ethical lens, and that's what I will try to do. I'm going to suggest that if we take into account demand as well as supply, we will get a more complicated ethical analysis than if we take into account supply only. I'm going to focus on developing countries, but I think that attention to the demand side is important also in regard to developed countries, and I'm going to say a few words about that in the end. The demand for falsified medicines in poor countries is almost certainly complex. There are many factors that are likely to contribute to it, but I would like to focus on one factor in particular, namely the lack of access to safe and effective drugs in developing countries. It's been estimated that almost 2 billion people worldwide lack access to essential medicines. And these essential medicines are not just any drugs, but they are drugs that, according to the WHO's definition, satisfy the priority healthcare needs of a population. Against this background, it's not unlikely that one of the reasons why people in the developing world consume poor quality medicines is simply that they lack good quality alternatives. So it seems highly plausible that the widespread consumption of this drug is, as Professor Newton and colleagues put it back in 2006, a component of the problem of insufficient access to essential drugs in many of the world's poorer countries. Now, I'm not going to speculate about how important the lack of access to adequate drugs is in generating demand for falsified drugs in causal terms. What I would like to suggest is that it's an especially salient factor if we look at it from an ethical perspective. access to essential medicines is ultimately a question of human rights. In international law, it is considered part of the human right to health. So the demand for falsified medicines is, in part at least, due to the fact that human rights are unfulfilled. Now, to frame the issue in terms of human rights is not just empty rhetoric, or shouldn't be just empty rhetoric, I think. The label of human rights matters, or should matter, to how we look at an ethical problem, in particular how we look at who's responsible for there being a problem and who is responsible for addressing the problem. And to explain why that is, I'm going to say just a few words about human rights. Rights in general are always held vis-à-vis some agent. It only makes sense to say that I have a right to something in case there is somebody who has a corresponding duty to make sure that the right is fulfilled or respected. What's special about human rights is that they're held vis-à-vis humanity as such. So in contrast to many other rights, they have a genuinely global scope. They don't, so to speak, respect national borders. They are, in an important sense, everyone's concern, which means that, in a way, we are all implicated when human rights remain unfulfilled, even when this happens in distant countries with which we don't directly interact. So I should explain and qualify this a little bit. In many cases, it makes sense that the primary responsibility to protect and fulfill human rights should lie with the government of each individual country. But when these governments fail to take up this responsibility, as often happens, the responsibility doesn't disappear, but it gets reassigned to other agents. Because perhaps these other agents are governments in other countries, perhaps they are intergovernmental organizations, but in any case, it's important to remember that these agents ultimately represent and act on the behalf of voters, which is to say each and every one of us. So the responsibility to ensure that human rights are fulfilled, so to speak, trickles down to us all. And when these rights remain unfulfilled, the moral failure is one in which we have a share. Now, this suggests that we need to broaden the ethical assessment of the global circulation of falsified medicines. It's certainly true that those who intentionally produce, distribute, and sell these products are acting wrongly and should be punished accordingly, but it would be too simple to attribute moral responsibility only to these agents. Producers, distributors, and sellers are to be understood, I think, as taking advantage of another prior and arguably more fundamental moral wrong, namely the failure to secure access to essential drugs in the developing world. It's partly because of this prior failure that they have a market for their products. And although governments and individuals in affluent countries are not directly involved in putting the products on the market, we are in part morally responsible for there being a market in the first place, because the demand for these products is one that we have not been able to satisfy in other ways. So what does this imply in terms of more concrete solutions to the problem of falsified medicines in the developing world? I'm certainly not the right person to work out detailed policy proposals, but I would like to offer 2 points to consider when thinking about how to address this problem in practice. The first is that part of the effort should be directed towards increasing access to essential drugs in the developing world. There are, of course, already a number of ways in which that might be achieved, and there are a number of agents that already work to this end, ranging from intergovernmental organizations to government agencies, NGOs, private actors. There's a wide range of initiatives in this area. And there are powerful moral reasons for states as well as individuals to support these initiatives quite independently of the problem of falsified medicines, because access to essential drugs is, as I've stressed, a matter of human rights. But once we see the lack of access to these drugs as contributing to the market for falsified medicines, there's also another reason. Lack of access to essential medicines is in fact doubly morally unacceptable. Not only does it leave people with their human right to health unfulfilled, it also feeds a criminal market that causes great additional harm to people's health, which I think increases the weight and urgency of our moral obligation to support initiatives to increase access to drugs in the developing world. The second point is that searching for solutions to the problem should be seen precisely as morally obligatory on the part of affluent countries and not just morally optional. So morally speaking, it's something that we must do. This task is not a matter of us generously helping them to deal with their problem. It should rather be thought of, at least in part, as us mitigating the consequences of a moral failure that is in part ours. So it's not just the magnitude of the problem that makes the search for solutions urgent, but it's also the fact that we're partly responsible for there being a problem in the first place. And recognizing this should help putting the search higher on the political agenda. So before ending, I'll just remark very briefly on in what way this kind of analysis that I've suggested might be relevant for developed countries. I've argued that inequalities between rich and poor countries in regard to access to drugs make people in poor countries more vulnerable to the harms caused by falsified medicines. But I would like to suggest now that there might also be inequalities within more affluent countries that make some people more vulnerable than others, and that we should pay attention to these inequalities as well. Just to begin with, we shouldn't forget that access to medicine and healthcare can be a concern even in affluent countries. There are certain groups, for instance undocumented migrants, who lack access to healthcare services that are otherwise universally provided. And drug prices can be an obstacle in affluent countries as well, at least for certain groups and for certain products and certain conditions. There could also be differences regarding trust in healthcare, possibly reflecting unequal treatment on the part of healthcare professionals or the healthcare system in general. A lack of trust in the system might well encourage people to look for medicines through other channels, for instance through unauthorized online vendors. Also, awareness and access to information about the dangers of falsified medicines presumably vary as well, perhaps reflecting more fundamental differences in regard to education, for instance, which might make some people more prone than others to seeking out this kind of products. So in short, we should be attentive to how social inequalities are reflected or manifested in the demand for falsified medicines in the developed world as well as in the developing world. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. You will come back in the panel, but is there any question right now, some clarifying question that you have, please?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a question of a reflection. I was extremely interested in this presentation. And I was wondering, not being an ethicist myself, if you can also incorporate somehow the concept of solidarity and North-South solidarity. Because I think, for instance, you were very correct in looking at the link between poor quality and lack of access. And what we are witnessing now with the prices of new medicines for hepatitis C or for cancer also skyrocketing in rich countries, the same situation that we have witnessed with HIV in poor countries could now also happen in our former rich countries. And a little bit the same line also with antimicrobial resistance. If we keep on not supporting the drug regulatory authorities in the south with the global resistance, we will also pay the consequences. So yeah, I was just wondering technically the concept of solidarity can be part of the ethics argumentation about this.
Well, I think you could get at similar conclusions from the point of view of sort of different concepts. I think I would prefer personally the sort of the concept of justice, which is a sort of in many ways a more stringent and more I think powerful moral category than solidarity maybe, but I think we could, starting from solidarity, we could get similar conclusions that there is an urgency and a moral obligation to address this problem, which has a global scope, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. You will come back. Förlåt, Anders Milton.
Thank you for a very interesting speech. A comment. When it comes to human rights, if I didn't misunderstand, I think you said that it was an issue between us and humanity, as it were. I would argue with that and say that it's a question of our relationship to our governments, because the governments have to see to it that we have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of education, etc., etc. If we give the responsibility to each and every one of us, then nobody is responsible, and then nobody can be challenged when it comes to breaking or to not giving people their human rights. So I think even according to the international law, it's a question of governments. The governments have a responsibility to see to it that human rights are in existence.
Yes. No, I think, and I don't think this is incompatible with what I said. What I said, I think, is at the most fundamental level, human rights are held vis-à-vis humanity as such, but in most cases, it certainly makes sense that humanity, so to speak, should delegate the responsibility to fulfill human rights to governments, yes, because among other, well, for other reasons, for a number of reasons, but among them precisely what you say: if everyone's responsible, then nobody's going to do it. But I think, and the point I was going to stress is that when governments fail to do this, it's not as if the responsibility or the obligation disappears, but it needs to get reassigned to some other agent, and that's what I was saying, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you.